Hello and welcome back to the caves, everybody. Today we are going over the Coilgun. This is Gunner's third secondary weapon and a very interesting gun overall. In this video we're going to be going over each of the overclocks for the Coilgun, a build that I'd recommend for it, and then a primary weapon in this case that I would also recommend with it. This isn't going to be all the builds that you can use with it. Like a lot of the builds in Deep Rock, they are very flexible, so feel free to experiment with these and try different loadouts how you would like them, as well as let's go over some of the pros and cons of the Coilgun right away, which I sometimes remember and sometimes forget during this series. So a couple of the major pros of the Coilgun: it hits really hard. It's really good at hitting really large enemies. It can also punch through walls, which is amazing in certain situations, especially if a teammate gets grabbed by a leech or gets grabbed by a grabber. You can usually hit them, assuming they're not on the other end of the cave, unless it's a big open cave, because the bullet from this moves extremely fast, or the projectile from this moves extremely fast, to where it's really easy to snipe things with this too. Downsides of this weapon, though, are that you do have to reload it after every single shot, so it doesn't really have fast follow-up shots, with some exceptions with some of the overclocks. And the other downside is that it does have to charge up, so you can't just immediately pull this out and shoot something, snipe something from a ways away. You do have to wait for it to charge up and then fire it. That can also be kind of cheated out based on mods and overclocks too. I guess we'll talk about that now. So first up, our very first overclock that we're going to be using is Hellfire. Hellfire is an unstable overclock for the Coilgun, and Hellfire is a pretty strong overclock. What Hellfire does is make it so every single one of your shots produces heat. Heat can build up an enemy's heat meter and light them on fire. This is in the exchange, though, of having a shorter trail duration. This used to actually have the 5-second duration. Now it only has 3 seconds because 5 seconds was really stupid with this and it was really strong. It does also reduce your ammo and it reduces your charge speed, so you do have to take even longer per shot and you don't have as much ammo. Fire from this is amazing for crowd control, though, because you can just light so many enemies on fire, and it's also really strong against the robot enemies. Since the heat lingers for so long, you're guaranteed to kill any of the turrets so long as you shoot next to them with this, and you can also kill the robots so long as they sit in the fire for just a second of it. It's really good for crowd control. It's probably one of Gunner's best secondary options for crowd control. This and magic bullets are probably the top two, I would say. And if you have a primary weapon that does well against big single targets, then this kind of has everything that you would want in it, besides maybe not being the best for like dreadnought missions, because the heat doesn't really matter on those since you can't light dreadnoughts on fire. The way I like to build Hellfire is like this. So in tier 1, I'm going with extra ammo. This is just to make up for the lack of ammo that we have. Each of them in tier 1 are really good, but ammo I think is the best for Hellfire. In tier 2, I have the faster reload speed. This is just so that I can keep shooting this more often. But honestly, any of them in tier 2 are pretty decent too, whether you want more damage or whether you want potentially fast follow-up shots with this. In tier 3, both options are really good. The stun and the fear is really good. I really like the fear with the fire, but stun is also amazing. Pick whichever one you want. They're both really good. In tier 4, we have a similar situation as in tier 3, where both are really good. I usually take the armor on this. That way, when we're charging this up, we get 50% damage reduction. This can be really good for a couple of reasons. One, if enemies are just right next to you hitting you, it makes it so you can tank through a bit more shots. But it can also be really useful for tanking through damage that you would otherwise take anyway. So if you're going to jump off of a cliff or something to where you need to get down somewhere, you can just charge this in hand, land on the ground, and then switch this out to your other weapon or use your pickaxe, and you won't fire a shot, and you'll still take the 50% reduced damage from the fall damage, which is really good. It also counts towards things like friendly fire as well, which can be kind of useful. And then in tier 5, I'm going with the larger trail. This is just so that we have a bigger AoE to hit more enemies with the fire, and so the fire can kind of linger in a larger space. It's really good for lighting multiple enemies on fire. However, all of them in tier 5 for this overclock are really good. Necrothermal Catalyst is super fun for just causing chain explosions, and it kind of gives you more crowd control, which this one doesn't necessarily need, but it is fun. And the electricity is also really good for just adding another stats effect. That way you got fire and electricity on something, and electricity lingers over the course of the trail, so it zaps things and slows them down, which can be really useful. This pairs really well with any sort of primary weapon that does high single target damage. I decided to pair this with the minigun and a little more oomph, which is a clean overclock, which makes it so the minigun has a faster spin up and a little bit more damage. Minigun is fantastic for taking out big enemies at a distance. This is really good for crowds. Our second overclock is Mole. Mole is a balanced overclock and one of the strongest overclocks in Gunner's arsenal, if I'm going to be honest. What Mole does is that you can punch through more surfaces than you otherwise would with the Coilgun, which the Coilgun can already pierce through a pretty decent chunk of land. And for every wall or surface that you punch through, you get additional damage added onto your shot when it hits the enemy. This is 150 damage. plus every single wall that you punch through. So if you punch through multiple walls, you can stack this damage up really, really high. It actually can be pretty crazy because you can make this to where it can one-shot almost anything in the game, or I guess it can one-shot anything in the game, assuming you're willing to put in enough effort and time to build yourself like a Swiss cheese castle to fire through. Not the most practical thing in the world, but very fun to do if you do get the chance to do it. Most of the time, I'm just trying to punch this through a single wall or through 2 walls so that we can get more damage towards big targets. The downside to this one is that we also have a slower charge speed, so you will kind of have to work with that. The way I like building Mole is like this. So in Tier 1, I'm going with more ammo. More ammo makes it so that we can use this more often, but all of them in Tier 1 are really good. Take whichever one you like. You could go with a faster charge up and have no downside to this, and it's really strong that way too. In Tier 2, I'm going with the Overcharger. This is just so that I can hit even harder if I really want to charge up the shots. This is specifically to hit big things with. If you don't plan on using that and you just kind of plan on using it for everything, then you don't necessarily need Overcharger, but it can be fun. In Tier 3, I'm going with the Stun, but Fear is also really good. Tier 4, the Shield, because I just like that for potentially not taking damage. And then in Tier 5, the Electricity. That way we can apply a status effect on top of our already existing really high damage. So if we don't kill something, we're at least slowing it down, which usually makes it really easy to do a follow-up shot through the wall too and hit them that way. So if you want to pair this with a primary weapon that does very well against multiple targets, then this can work really well in combination. I decided to pair this with Rocket Barrage for the Hurricane. This one is a very fun overclock, but you could replace this with a whole bunch of other overclocks for the Hurricane, for the minigun, or for the autocannon. They're all really solid. Rocket Barrage allows me just to spew out rockets towards anything that I want. These aren't guided rockets, but they are pretty good against crowds. You do get a lot of them, and they do decent damage per second. For our third overclock, we have Triple Tech Chamber. Triple Tech Chamber is an unstable overclock that allows you to fire up to 3 times from the coil gun. The way you use this is you charge up your shot, you fire 1 shot, and then you get a chance to fire another shot and another shot after that. These do consume additional ammo with the other 2 shots, and they do reduce damage than the primary shot, as well as the 2 additional shots cannot pen through surfaces like the first shot can. There's about a 1-second window in between each of these shots that you can fire. This can be really good against crowds of enemies as well as single targets, because you can just fire 3 shots at a single target and deal high damage, or you can fire this across a wave of crowds because this does still have a lingering damage effect even without any sort of mods to it. The mods that I do like to run are like this. So in Tier 1, I'm usually taking ammo with this one just so that I can use it more often, but the charge speed and the damage are also pretty good. In Tier 2, I'm taking a faster reload. This is just so that I can reload it and keep firing it more often. Both the other options in Tier 2 are pretty good though too. In Tier 3, Stun is really nice with this because each round can stun. Fear is also pretty good because each round can fear then too if you want to do that, and Fear and Stun are 2 of the strongest status effects in the game. In Tier 4, I'm going with the Shield. Again, both these options are pretty good, and you might want to go with the increased damage at close range if you find yourself using this at close range. That can actually be pretty good since you do get 3 shots out of this. And then in Tier 5, the Electricity Trail is really good with this one because you can fire out 3 lines of electricity where enemies walk through and then take steady damage over time and get slowed down. This used to be probably the most broken overclock in the game when it was actually bugged and wasn't working correctly, because you could have 50% damage reduction the entire time with this. But that has been patched out, so that's no longer a factor with this particular overclock, and that's probably for the best, because that was pretty dumb to just take half damage from everything for the entire match. This one does pair really well with any of the primary weapons. I decided to pair it with the autocannon, and I took the newly modified Carpet Bomber overclock, which gives you a lot more crowd control with the autocannon, which it already has a lot, but this way you can rip through crowds even quicker. For our fourth overclock, we have kind of a weird one. This is a clean overclock called Re-Atomizer. What Re-Atomizer allows you to do is when you fire the coil gun at an enemy that is affected by some sort of status effect, you can then transfer that status effect to another enemy that you pierce through. That is already kind of weird and very difficult to do a lot of the time, as well as it does come with some issues which we'll talk about in a little bit. The way I usually build Re-Atomizer is like this. So in Tier 1, I'm taking the faster charge speed just so that I can use it more often. This does kind of help with fast follow-up shots. Same thing goes with the reload speed in Tier 2. This is just so that I can potentially use it more often. In Tier 3, I'm going with the Stun. In Tier 4, the Shield. And then in Tier 5, the Electricity. Now, the Electricity, you can technically put on multiple enemies, but you're going to do it regardless as long as you hit. And that's where kind of the problem with Re-Atomizer comes up. That most of the time you can apply the status effects really easy by yourself with whatever weapon. I did pair this with the Neurotoxin Payload overclock with the autocannon, which is a very strong overclock, and this way we can put Neurotoxin on further away enemies, so we shoot something up close, put Neurotoxin on it, and then fire the coil gun shot through that enemy and into another enemy to put Neurotoxin on them. The main problem with that is that the autocannon could already probably splash the Neurotoxin to it. So Re-Atomizer is a very awkward overclock that I don't really use that much. It can be a really fun one, and it has been bugged multiple times where it's been stronger than this, where you could put like the elite status effect from enemies onto your Steve, so you could always have an elite Steve. That was really cool, although you could also put it on other enemies, which could get you killed. For our 5th overclock, we have Backfeeding Module. This one's a more straightforward overclock. You lose damage, but you gain a lot more ammo. And you can stack this with a ton of ammo if you'd like to, and that is a pretty fun way to build it, and that's the way that I built it here. So in Tier 1, I'm taking extra ammo. This is just so that we can have more ammo overall, and we get a ton of shots with this. In Tier 2, I'm going with Overcharger so we can get a little bit more damage. You could take the Controlled Magnetic Flow in Tier 2, and have a ton of sustained fire with this, and that can kind of work against crowds, especially if you take the electricity in Tier 5 like we're doing. But it's a little bit awkward. I kind of like Overcharger a little bit more, so if I do need to hit big things a little bit harder, I can do that. The reload speed is also really good in Tier 2. In Tier 3, I like going with the stun, just so we can stun more enemies, but fear is really good too. Tier 4, shield, because I like that a little bit more than the up-close damage, but it's not bad on this one either. And then in Tier 5, the electricity, so we can get a little bit more status effects and damage over time, as well as some slowdowns on it, which can be pretty good. I decided to take one of my favorite overclocks for Gunner's primaries, and that is Bullet Hell for the minigun, which allows you to have bouncy bullets, which can bounce into other enemies, although your minigun does do less damage and it is less accurate. Super fun overclock, and this is a very fun build to use, although I don't think this would be the strongest use of Backfeeding Module, or even Bullet Hell for that matter, but still a really fun build to play around with. And then for our final overclock, we have another clean overclock. This is Ultra Magnetic Coils. This one increases the radius of your trail, as well as it increases the lingering duration of your trail. That's pretty nice, and I actually like building this for its even larger trail, although you can build it for a longer lasting electricity trail, which is also good. This is a clean overclock, so you can kind of build it however you'd like. This is usually the way I build it, so in Tier 1 I'm going with a faster charge speed, but ammo or damage is really good too. Tier 2 I'm taking the faster reload speed, just so that I can have somewhat fast follow-up shots with this, but again, any of them in Tier 2 are good. Tier 3, both are awesome, pick whichever one you like more. Tier 4, same deal, both are awesome, pick whichever one you like more. And then in Tier 5, I like going with the even bigger trail, that way we just have a huge amount of area covered. And this still will deal damage over time from the linger. If you want to have a longer lasting electricity trail though, you could do that and it works really well. And of course you could take the necrothermal catalyst, or whatever the heck it's called, in Tier 5 too, if you have a fire primary weapon. So if you're taking the Hurricane or you're taking the minigun and you've built them for that. Autocannon can't have fire on it. I guess you could also do it if you're taking fire grenades, but that would be not really advised, at least if that's the only fire you have. And then for a primary weapon, I decided to pair this with the Hurricane once again, with overtuned feeding mechanism. This one is just a solid all-around overclock, and it kind of goes well with anything. This clean overclock from the Coilgun also goes well with anything, so you can change this however you would like. And that's all the overclocks for the Coilgun. Hopefully this kind of helped you out and gave you some ideas for builds that you might want to try. Tell me your thoughts on the Coilgun and its overclocks down in the comments below. I would love to hear them. I think it's a really cool weapon. I think it's really awesome that it can punch through walls, and some of its overclocks are really awesome, like Hellfire and Mole. Thank you guys so very much for watching this. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will talk to you next time. Bye-bye!